Thing on the Doorstep by H.P. Lovecraft. It is true that I have sent 6 bullets to the head of my best friend, and yet I hope to show by this statement that I am not his murderer. At first I should be called a madman, madder than the man I shot in his cell at the Arkham Sanatorium. Later, some of my readers will weigh each statement, correlate it with known facts, and ask themselves how I could have believed otherwise than I did after facing the evidence of that horror, that thing on the doorstep. Until then, I also saw nothing but madness in the wild tales I have acted on. Even now, I ask myself whether I was misled, whether I'm not mad after all. I do not know. But others have strange things to tell of Edward and Asneth Derby, and even these stolid police are at their wits' end to account for the last terrible visit. They have tried weakly to concoct a theory of a ghastly jest or warning by discharged servants, yet they know in their hearts that the truth is something infinitely more terrible and incredible. So I say that I have not murdered Edward Derby. Rather, I have avenged him, and in so doing purged the earth of a horror whose survival might have loosed untold horrors on all mankind. There are black zones of shadow close to our daily paths, and now and then some evil soul breaks a passage through. When that happens, the man who knows must strike before reckoning the consequences. I have known Edward Pickman Derby all his life. 8 years my junior, he was so precocious that we had much in common from the time he was 8 and I 16. He was the most phenomenal child scholar I have ever known, and at 7 was writing verses of a somber, fantastic, almost morbid cast, which astonished the tutors surrounding him. Perhaps his private education and coddled seclusion had something to do with his premature flowering. An only child, he had organic weaknesses which startled his doting parents and caused them to keep him closely chained to their side. He was never allowed out without his nurse and seldom had a chance to play unconstrainedly with other children. All this doubtless fostered a strange, secretive inner life in the boy, with imagination as his only avenue of freedom. At any rate, his juvenile learning was prodigious and bizarre, and his facile writing such as to captivate me despite my greater age. About that time, I had leanings toward art of a somewhat grotesque cast, and I found in this young child a rare kindred spirit. What lay behind our joint love of shadows and marvels was no doubt the ancient, mouldering and subtly fearsome town in which we lived, which cursed and legend haunted Arkham, whose huddled, sagging gramble roofs and crumbling Georgian balustrades rode out the centuries, the darkly muttering miskatonic. As time went by, I turned to architecture and gave up my design of illustrating a book of Edward's daemonic poems. Yet our companion suffered no lessening. Young Derby's odd genius developed remarkably, and in his 18th year, he collected nightmare lyrics made a real sensation when issued under the title Abeloth and Other Horrors. He was a close correspondent of notorious Bolidarian poet Justin Joffrey, who wrote The People of the Monmouth and died screaming in a madhouse in 1926 after a visit to a sinister and ill regarded village in Hungary. In self reliance and practical affairs, however, Derby was greatly retarded because of his coddled existence. His health had improved, but his habits of childish dependence were fostered by overcaring parents, so that he never traveled alone, made independent decisions, or assumed responsibilities. It was early seen that he would not be equal to a struggle in a business or professional arena. But the family fortune was so ample that this formed no tragedy. As he grew to years of manhood, he retained a deceptive aspect of boyishness. Blond and blue-eyed, he had the fresh complexion of a child. His attempts to raise a mustache were discernible only with difficulty. His voice was soft and light, and his pampered, unexercised life gave him a juvenile chubbiness rather than the paunchiness of mature middle age. He was of good height, and his handsome face would have made him a notable gallant had not his shyness held him to a seclusion and bookishness. Derby's parents took him abroad every summer, and he was quick to seize on the surface aspects of European thought and expression. His Pole-like life, Pole-like talents turned more and more towards the decadent, and other artistic sensitivities and yearnings were half aroused in him. In a great discussion in those days, I had been through Harvard, had studied in a Boston architecture's office, had married and finally returned to Arkham to practice my profession, settling in the family homestead of Stalstill Street. Since my father had moved to Florida for his health, Edward used to call almost every evening till I came to regard him as one of the household. He had a characteristic way of ringing the doorbell or sounding the knocker that grew to be a veritable code signal, so that after dinner I always listened for the familiar three brisk stroke, followed by two more after a pause. Less frequently I would visit at his house and note with envy the obscure volumes in his constantly growing library. Derby went through Miskatonic University in Arkham, since his parents would not let him abroad away from them, board away from them. He entered at 16 and contemplated his course in three. He entered at 16 and completed his course in 3 years, majoring in English and French literature, and receiving high marks in everything but mathematics and science. He mingled very little with other students, though looked enviously at the dating or bohemian set whose superficially smart language and meaningless ironic pose he aped, and whose dubious conduct he wished he dared adopt. What he did do was to become an almost fanatical devotee of subterranean magical lore, which, for which Miss Catonic's library was and is famous. Also a dweller on the surface of phantasm and strangeness, he now delved deep into the actual ruins and riddles left by fabulous past for the guidance or puzzlement of posterity. He read things like the Book of Eben and the Unaswekin Cotton of Von Yotz, and the forbidden Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul Azalhad. Though he did not tell his parents he had, and though he did not tell his parents he had seen them. Edward was 20 when my son and only child was born, and seemed pleased when I named the newcomer Edward Derby Upton after him. By the time he was 25, Edward Derby was a prodigiously learned man and fairly well known poet and fanaticist. Though his lack of contacts and responsibilities had slowed down his literary growth by making his products derivative and over bookish. I was perhaps his closest friend, finding him an unexhaustible mine of vital theoretical topics. He relied on me for advice in whatever matter he did not wish to refer to his parents. He remained single more through shyness, inertia, and parental protectiveness than through inclination, and moved in society only to the slightest and most perfunctory extent. When the war came, both health and ingrained timidity kept him at home. I went to Plattsburgh for a commission, but never got overseas. So the years wore on. Edward's mother died when he was 34, and for 4 months he was incapacitated by some odd psychological malady. His father took him to Europe, however, and he managed to pull out of his trouble without visible effect. Afterwards, he seemed to feel a sort of grotesque exhilaration, as if a partial escape from some unseen bondage. He began to mingle in more advanced college sets despite his middle age, and was present at some extremely wild doings on one occasion, paying heavy blackmail. which he brought for me to keep his presence and a certain affair from his father's notice. Some of the widespread rumors about the wild Miskatonic set were extremely singular. There was even talk of a black magic and of happenings utterly beyond credibility. Edward was 38 when he met Asnith Waite. She was, I judged, about 23 at the time, and was taking a special course in medieval metaphysics at Miskatonic. The daughter of a friend of mine, and had met her before in the Hall School of Kingsport, and had been inclined to shun her because of her odd reputation. She was dark, smallish, and very good looking except for an over protuberance eyes. But something in that expression alienated extreme sensitive people. It was, however, largely her origin and conversation which caused average folk to avoid her. She was one of the Innsmouth Waits, and dark legends have clustered for generations about crumbling, half deserted Innsmouth and its people. There are tales of horrible bargains about the year 1850, and of a strange element not quite human in ancient families of the run-down fishing port. Tales such as old-time Yankees, Tales such as old-time Yankees can devise and repeat with proper awesomeness. Asnescape was aggravated by the fact that she was Ephraim Waite's daughter, the child of his old age by an unknown wife who always went veiled. Ephraim lived in a half-decayed mansion in Washington Street, Innsmouth, and those who'd seen the place, often folk avoid going to Innsmouth whenever they can, declare that the attic windows were always boarded, and that strange sounds sometimes floated from within as evening drew on. The old man was known to have been a prodigious magical student in his day, and legends aver that he could raise or quell storms at sea according to his whim. I had seen him once or twice in my youth as he came to Arkham to consult forbidden tomes at the college library, and hated his wolfish, saturnine face with its tangle of iron gray beard. He had died insane under rather queer circumstances, just before his daughter, by his will, made a nominal ward of the principal, entered the Hall School. But she had been his morbidly avid pupil and looked fiendishly like him at times. A friend's daughter who had gone to school with Aston's Waite repeated many curious things, and the news of Edward's acquaintance with her began to spread about. Asnath, it seemed, had possessed a kind of Asnath, it seemed, had posed as a kind of magician at school, and had really seemed able to accomplish some highly baffling marvels. She professed to be able to raise thunderstorms, though her success was generally laid to some uncanny knack of prediction. All else markedly disliked her, and she could make any doll howl by certain motions of her right hand. There were times when she displayed snatches of knowledge and language very singular and very shocking for a young girl. Yeah, and she would frighten her schoolmates with leers and winks of a inexplicable kind, and would seem to exact an obscure and zestful irony from her presented situation. Most unusual, though, were the well-timed cases of her influence over other persons. She was beyond question a genuine hypnotist. By gazing purely at a fellow student, she would often give the latter a distinct feeling of exchanged personality, as if the subject were placed momentarily in the magician's body and able to stare half across the room at her real body, whose eyes blazed and protruded with an alien expression. Asimov made wild claims about the nature of consciousness and about the independence of the physical frame, or at least from life processes of the physical frame. Her chronic rage, however, was that she was not born a man, since she believed a male brain had certain unique and far reaching cosmic powers. Given a man's brain, she declared, she could not only equal but surpass her father in mastery of unknown forces. Edward met Aseneth at a gathering of intellectuals held in one of the student rooms and could talk of nothing else when he came to see me the next day. He'd found her full of the interests and eccentricities which engrossed him most, and which addition wildly taken with her appearance. I had never seen the young woman and recalled casual reference only faintly, but I knew who she was. It seemed rather regrettable that Derby should become so upheaved about her. I said nothing to discourage him, since infatuation thrives on opposition. He was not, he said, mentioning her to his father. In the next few weeks, I heard of very little but Asneth from young Derby. Others now remarked Edward's nuptial gallantry, though they agreed that he did not look even nearly his actual age, nor seemed at all inappropriate as an escort for his bizarre divinity. He was only a trifle paunchy despite his indolence and his self-indulgence, and his face was absolutely without lines. Asneth, on the other hand, had the premature crow's feet which comes from the exercise of intense will. About this time, Edward brought the girl to call on me, and I at once saw that his interest was by no means one sided. She eyed him continually with an almost predatory air, and I perceived their intimacy was beyond any untangling. Soon afterwards, I had a visit from old Mr. Derby, who I had always admired and respected. He had heard the tales of his son's new friendship and had wormed the truth out of the boy. Edward meant to marry Asneth and had even been looking at houses in the suburbs. Knowing my usual great influence with his son, the father wondered if I could help to break the ill-advised affair off. When I regretfully expressed my doubts, this time it was not a question of Edward's weak will, but of the woman's strong will. The perennial child had transferred his dependence from his parental image to a new and stronger image, and nothing could be done about it. The wedding was performed a month later by a justice of the peace according to the bride's request. Mr. Derby, at my advice, offered no opposition, and he, my wife and son, and I attended the brief ceremony, the other guests being wild young people from the college. Agnes had brought an old crown and shield place. Sorry, Agnes had bought an old crown and shield place in the country at the end of High Street, and they proposed to settle there after a short trip to Innsmouth, whence their servants and some books and household goods were to be brought. It was probably not so much consideration for Edward and his father as a personal wish to be near the college, its library, and its crowd of sophisticates that made Aslan settle in Arkham instead of returning permanently home. When Edward called on me after the honeymoon, I thought he looked slightly changed. Asneth had made him get rid of that underdeveloped mustache. There was also more than that. He looked soberer and more thoughtful, his habitual pout of childish rebelliousness being exchanged for a look of almost genuine sadness. I was puzzled to I was puzzled to decide whether I liked or disliked the change. Certainly he seemed more normally adult than ever before. Perhaps the marriage was a good thing. Might not the change of dependency form a start towards actual neutralization, leading ultimately to the responsible independence? He came alone, for Aseneth was very busy. She had bought a vast store of books and apparatuses from Innsmouth. Derby shuddered as he spoke of the name, and was finishing the restoration of the Crownshield house and grounds. Her home in that town was a rather disquieting place, but certainly others in it had taught him some surprising things. He was progressing fast in his esoteric lore now that he had Asen's guidance. Some of the experiments she proposed were so daring and radical he did not feel at liberty to describe them. But he had confidence in her power and intentions. The three servants were queer, including aged couple who had been with old Ephraim and referred occasionally to him and to Asnath's dead mother in a cryptic way, and a swarthy young wench who had markedly abnormalities of features and seemed to exude a perpetual odor of fish. The next 2 years I saw less and less of Derby. A fortnight would sometimes slip by without the familiar 3 and 2 stroke at the front door, and when he did call, or when, as happened with increasing infrequency, I called on him, he was very little disposed to converse on vital topics. Had become secretive about occult studies, which he used to describe and discuss so minutely and preferred not to talk of his wife. She had aged tremendously since the marriage, till now, oddly enough, she seemed the elder of the two. Her face, her face held the most concentration determination. Her face held the most concentratedly determined expression I had ever seen, and her whole aspect seemed to gain a vague, unplaceable repulsiveness. My wife and son noticed it as much as I, and we all ceased gradually to call on her, for which Edward admitted in one of his boyish, tactless moments she was unmitigatedly grateful. Occasionally, the Dervish would go on long trips, ostentation to Europe, though Edward sometimes hinted at more obscure destinations. It was after the first year that people began talking about the change in Edward Derby. It was very casual talk. The change was purely psychological, but it brought about some interesting points. Now and then it seemed Edward was observed to wear an expression and to do things wholly incompatible with his usual flabby nature. For example, although in the old days he could not drive a car, he was now seen occasionally to dash in and out of the old Shield driveway with Aston's powerful Packard, handling with a master and meeting traffic entanglements with a skill and determination utterly alien to his accustomed nature. In such cases, he seemed to be almost In such cases, he seemed always to be back from some trip or just starting on one. What sort of trips no one could guess, mostly, although he mostly favored the Innsmouth road. Oddly, mes- oddly, the metaphysicism did not seem altogether pleasing. People said he looked too much like his wife, or like old Ephraim Waite himself. In these moments, or perhaps these moments seemed unnatural because they were so rare. Sometimes, hours after starting out in this way, he would return listlessly sprawled on the rear seat of the car when Osley hired chauffeur or mechanic drove. Though the prepon- this Although his preponderant aspect of the streets during his decreasing rounds of social contact, including, I may say, his calls upon me, was the old-time, indecisive one, its irresponsible childish even more marked than in the past. While Aslan's face aged, Edward's, aside from those exceptional occasions, actually relaxed in a kind of exaggerated immaturity, save when a trace of the new sadness or understanding would flash across it. It was really very puzzling. Meanwhile, the Derbys almost dropped out of the gay college circle. Not through their own disgust, we heard, but because something about their present studies shocked even the most callous of the other decadents. It was in the third year of the marriage that Edward began to hint openly to me of a certain fear and dissatisfaction. He would let fall remarks about things going too far, and would talk darkly about the need of saving his identity. At first I ignored such references, but in time I began to question him guardedly, remembering my friend's daughters remembering what my friend's daughter had said about Asneth's hypnotic influence over the other girls at school. The cases where students had thought they were in bodies looking across the room at themselves. The questioning seemed to make him at once alarmed and grateful. And once he mumbled something about having a serious talk with me later. About this time, old Mr. Derby died, for which I was afterwards very thankful. Edward was badly upset, though by no means disorganized. He had seen astonishing little of his parents since his marriage, for Aseneth had concentrated in herself all the vital senses of family linkage. Some called him callous in his loss, especially since those jaunty and confident moods in the car began to increase. He now wished to move back into the old Derby mansion, but Aseneth insisted on staying in the Crownshield house, to which she had become well adjusted. Not long afterwards, my wife heard a curious thing from a friend, one of the few who had not dropped the derbies. She had been out at the end of the high street to call on the couple and had seen a car shooting briskly out of the driveway with Edward oddly confident and almost sneering face above the wheel. Ringing the bell, she had been told by the repulsive wench that Aseneth was out, but had chanced to look up at the house in leaving. There, at one of Edward's library windows, she had glimpsed a hastily withdrawn face whose expression of pain, defeat, and wistful hopelessness was poignant beyond description. It was incredible. It was incredible enough in a view of its own usual domineering cast. Incredibly enough, in a view of its usual domineering cast, Asenath. Yet the caller had vowed that in that instant the sad, muddled eyes of poor Edward were gazing out from it. Edward's calls now grew a trifle more frequent, and his hints occasionally became concrete. What he said was not to be believed, even in centuried and long haunted Arkham. But he threw out his dark lore with a serenity and conviction which made one fear for his sanity. He talked about terrible meetings in lonely places, of cyclopean ruins in the heart of the Maine woods beneath which vast staircases led down to abyssal of night-ridden streets, of complex angles that led through invisible walls to other regions of space and time, and of hideous exchanges of personality that permeates explorations in remote and forbidden places, on other worlds and in different space-time continua. He would now and then back up certain crazy hints by exhibiting objects which utterly nonplussed me, elusively colored and baffling textured objects like nothing ever heard of on Earth, whose insane curves and surfaces answered no conceivable purpose and followed no conceivable geometry. These things, he said, came from outside, and his wife knew how to get them. Sometimes, but always in frightened and ambiguous whispers, he would suggest things about old Ephraim Waite, whom we had seen occasionally at the college library in the old days. This abundant, these abundant apparitions were never specific, but seemed to revolve around some especially horrible doubt as to whether the old wizard were really dead, in a spiritual as well as corporeal sense. At times, Durwood would halt abruptly in his revelations, and I wondered whether Aseneth could possibly have divined his speech at a distance and cut him off through some unknown sort of telepathic mesmerism, some power of the kind she had displayed at school. Certainly, she suspected that he told me things. For as the weeks passed, she tried to stop his visits with words and glances of a inexplicable potency. Only with difficulty could he get to see me, for although he would pretend to go somewhere else, some invisible force would generally clog his motions or make him forget his destination for the time being. Visits usually came when Aseneth was away in her body, as he once oddly put it. She always found out later. The servants watched his goings and comings, but evidently she thought it inexpedient to do anything drastic. Derby had been married more than 3 years on that August day when I got the telegram from Maine. I had not seen him for 2 months, but had heard of he was away on business. Asneth was supposed to be with him, though watchful gossip declared there was someone upstairs in the house, behind the doubly curtained window. They had watched the purchase made by the servants, and now the town marshal of Chiswick had wired of the draggled madman who stumbled out of the woods with delirious ravings and screamed to me for protection. It was Edward, and he had been just able to recall his own name and mine and address. Chiswick is close to the wildest, deepest, and least explored forest belted in Maine, and took a whole day of feverish jolting through fantastic and forbidding scenery to get there in a car. I found Derby and Estelle at the town farm, vacillating between frenzy and apathy. He knew me at once and began pouring out a measly half torrent of words in my direction. Dan, for God's sake, the pits of the Shoggoth, down the 6,000 steps, the abominations of abominations. I never would have let her take me, and then I found myself there, Ebel shot in Ethgra. The shape rose from the altar, and there were 500 that howled, the hooded thing bleating, Camog, Camog. There was old Afron's secret name in the coffin. I was there when she promised she wouldn't take me. I was there where she promised she wouldn't take me. A minute before I was locked in the library, and then I was there where she had gone with my body, in the place of utter blasphemy, the unholy pit where Black Realm begins, and the watcher guarded the gate. I saw Shoggoth. It changed shape. I can't stand it. I won't stand. I'll kill her if she ever sends me there again. I'll kill that entity. Her, him, it. I'll kill it. I'll kill it with my own hands. It took me an hour to quiet him, but he subsided at last. The next day I got him decent clothes in the village and set out with him for Arkham. His fury of hysteria was spent, and he was inclined to be silent, though he began muttering darkly to himself when the car passed through Augusta, as if the sight of the city aroused unpleasant memories. It was clear that he did not wish to go home, and considering the fantastic delusions he seemed to be having about his wife, delusions undoubtedly spring from some actual hypnotic ordeal to which he had been subjected, and that would be better if he did not. I would, I resolved, put him up myself for a time, no matter what unpleasantness it would make with Asneth. Later, I would help him get a divorce, for most assuredly there was mental factors which made the marriage suicidal for him. When we struck open country again, Derby's mutterings faded away, and let him nod and drowse on the seat beside me as I drove. During our sunset dash through Portland, the mutterings commenced once again, more distinctive than before, and as I listened, I caught a stream of utterly insane drivel about Asneth. The extent to which she had preyed on Edward's nerves was plain, for he had woven a whole set of hallucinations around her. His present predicament, he muttered perfectly, was one of a long series. She was getting hold of him, and he knew that some day she would never let go. Even now, she probably let him go only when she had to, because she couldn't hold on long at a time. She constantly took his body and went to nameless places for nameless rites, leaving him in her body and locking him upstairs. But sometimes she couldn't hold on, and he would find himself suddenly in his own body again in some far off, horrible, and perhaps unknown place. Sometimes she'd get a hold of him, and sometimes she couldn't. Often he was left stranded wherever, as I had found him. Time and again he had to find his way home from frightful distances, getting someone to drive the car after he found it. The worst thing was that she was holding on to him longer and longer at a time. She wanted to be a man, to be fully human. That was why she got hold of him. She had sensed the mixture of fine wrought brain and weak will in him. Some day she would crowd him out and disappear with his body. Disappear to become a great magician like her father and leave him marooned in that female shell that wasn't even human. Yes, he knew about the Innsmouth blood now. There had been traffic with things from the sea. It was horrible. And old Ephraim, he had known the secret, and when he grew old, did a hideous thing to keep alive. He wanted to live forever. Athens would succeed. One successful demonstration had taken place already. As Derby muttered on, I turned to look at him closely, verifying the impression of change which an earlier scrutiny had given me. Paradoxically, he seemed in better shape than usual, harder, more normally developed, and with a trace of sickly flabbiness caused by his inland habits. It was as if he had been really active and properly exercised for the first time in his cuddle life. I judged Aslan's force must have pushed him into unwanted channels of motion and alertness. But just now his mind was in a pitiable state, where he was muttering and mumbling with wild extravagance about his wife, about black magic, and about old Ephraim, about some revelation which convinced even me. He repeated names which I recognized from bygone browsings in forbidden volumes, and at times made me shudder with a certain dread of mythological consistency, of convincing coherence, which ran through his maunderings. Again and again he would pause as if to gather courage for some final and terrible disclosure. Dan, Dan, don't you remember him? The wild eyes, the unkempt beard that never turned white. He glared at me once. I never forgot it. Now she glares that way, and I know why. He found it in Necronomicon, the formula. I don't dare tell you the page yet. When I do, you can read and understand. And you will know what has engulfed me. On and on and on and on, body to body to body. He means to never die. The life glow, he knows how to break the link. It can flicker a while even when the body is dead. I'll give you hints and maybe you'll guess. Listen, man. Do you know why my wife always takes such pains with her silly backhand writing? Have you ever seen a mention of old Ephraim's? Do you want to know why I shivered when I saw some hasty note Asnith had jotted down? Asnith, is there such a person? Why did they half think there was poison in old Ephraim's stomach? Why do the Gillums whisper about the way he sickened like a frightened child when he went mad and Aslan locked him up in the attic room where the other had been? Was it old Ephraim's soul that was locked in? Who looked out in whom? Why had he been looking for months for someone with a fine mind and weak will? Why did he curse that his daughter wasn't a son? Tell me, Daniel Upton, what devilish exchange was permeated in the house of horror where the blasphemous monster had his trusting, weak-willed, and half-human child at his mercy? Didn't he make it permanent, as she'll do to me in the end? Tell me why that thing called itself Ass. Why do Tell me why that thing that calls itself Asness writes different when off guard so that you can't tell if the script's from. Then the thing happened. Derby's voice was rising in a thin, tremulous scream as he raved, and suddenly was shut off with an almost mechanical click. I thought of those other occasions at home when his confidence had abruptly ceased, when I had half fancied that there was some obscure telepathic wave as its mental force. when I half fancied that some obscure telepathic wave of Asenth's mental force was intervening to keep him silent. This, though, was something altogether different, and I felt infinitely more horrible. The face beside me was twisted almost unrecognizably for a moment, although the whole body there was a shivering motion, as if all the bones, organs, muscles, nerves, and glands were readjusting themselves to a radically different posture, instead of sternness and general personality. Just where the supreme horror lay, I could not, for my life, tell. Yet there swept over me such a swamping wave of sickness and repulsion, such a freezing, petrifying sense of utter alienation and abnormality, that my grasp on the wheel grew feeble and uncertain. This figure beside me seemed less like a lifelong friend than some monstrous intrusion from outer space, some damnable, utterly cursed force of unknown and malign cosmic forces. I had faltered only a moment, but before another moment was over, my companion had seized the wheel and forced me to change places with him. The dusk was now very thick, and the lights of Portland far behind, so I could not see much of his face. The blaze of his eyes, though, was phenomenal. I knew that we must now be. I knew now that he must now be in that queer, energized state, so unlike the usual self, which so many people had noticed. It seemed oddly and incredibly that listless Edward Derby, who had never asserted himself and who had never learned to drive, would be ordering me about and taking the wheel of my own car. But that was precisely what had happened. He did not speak this for some time, and in my inexplicable horror, I was glad he did not. In the lights of Bittleford and Soko, I saw his firmly set mouth and shivered at the blaze in his eyes. People were right. He did look damnably like his wife, and like old Ephraim when he was in these moods. I did not wonder that the moods were dislike. There was certainly something unnatural and diabolical in them, and I felt the sinister elements all the more because of the wild ravings I had been hearing. This man, for all my lifelong knowledge of Edward Pickman Derby, was a stranger, an intrusion of some sort from the black abyss. He did not speak until we were on a dark stretch of road, and when he did, his voice seemed utterly unfamiliar. It was deeper, firmer, and more decisive than I had ever known it to be, while his accent and pronunciation were altogether changed, though vaguely, remotely, and rather disturbingly recalling something I could not quite place. There was, I thought, a trace of very profound and very genuine irony in the timbre, not the flashy, meaningless, jaunty pseudo-irony of the callow sophisticate which Derby had habitually affected, but something grim, basic, pervasive, and potentially evil. I marveled at this self-possession with such falling the spell of neck struck muttering, I hope you forget I hope you for I hope you'll forget my attack back there, Upton. He was saying. You know what my nerves are, and I guess you can excuse such things. I'm enormously grateful, of course, for this lift home. And you must forget, too, any crazy things I might have been saying about my wife, and about things in general. That's what comes from overstudy in a field like mine. My, my philosophy is full of bizarre concepts. When the mind gets worn out, it cooks up all sorts of imaginary concrete applications. I shall take a rest from now on. You probably won't see me for some time, and you needn't blame Asenath for it. This trip was a queer one, but it's really very simple. There are certain Indian relics in the northern woods, standing stones and all that, which mean a good deal in folklore. And Asenath and I are following the stuff up. It was a hard search, so I seem to have gone off my head. I must send somebody for the car when I get home. A month's relaxation will put me back on my feet. I do not recall just what my own part in the conversation was, for the baffling alienage of my seatmate fills all my consciousness. With every moment, my feelings of elusive cosmic horror increased till at length I was in a veritable delirium of longing for the end of this drive. Derby did not offer to relinquish the wheel, and I was glad of the speed with which Portsmouth and Newburyport flashed by. At the junction where the main highway runs inland, in, at the junction where the main highway runs inland and avoids Innsmouth, I was half afraid my driver would take the bleak shore road that goes through the damned old place. He did not, however, but darted rapidly past Raleigh and Ipswich towards the destination. We reached Arkham before midnight and found the lights still on in the old Carnshield house. Derby left the car with a hasty repetition of his thanks, and I drove home alone with a curious feeling of relief. It had been a terrible drive, all the more terrible because I could not quite tell why, and I did not regret Derby's forecast of a long absence of his company. Next 2 months were full of rumors. People spoke of seeing Derby more and more in his new, energized state, and Asneth was scarcely ever seen the and Asneth was scarcely ever into her few callers. I had only one visit from Edward, when he called briefly in Asneth's car, duly reclaimed from wherever he had left it in Maine, to get some books he had lent me. He was in this new state, paused only long enough for some evasive polite remarks. It was plain that he had nothing to discuss with me when in this condition, and I noticed that he did not even trouble to give the old 3 and 2 signals when ringing the doorbell. As on the evening in the car, I felt a faint, infinitely deep horror with which I could not explain, so that the swift departure was a prodigious relief. In mid-September, Derby was away for a week, and some of the decadent college set talked knowingly of the matter, being at a meeting with a notorious cult leader lately expelled from England, who had established headquarters in New York. For my part, I could not get the strange ride from Maine out of my head. The transformation I had witnessed had affected me profoundly, and I caught myself again and again trying to account for the thing and for the extreme horror it had inspired in me. But the oddest rumors were those about the sobbing in the old Crown Shield house. The voice seemed to be a woman's, and some of the younger people thought it sounded like Asnith. It was heard only at rare intervals and would sometimes be choked off as if by force. There was talk of an investigation, but this was dispelled one day when Asnith appeared in the streets and chatted in a spring, spring, sprightly way with a large number of acquaintances, apologizing for her recent absence and speaking incidentally about the nervous breakdown and hysteria of a guest from Boston. The guest was never seen, but Asneth's appearance left nothing to be said, and then someone complicated matters by whispering that these sobs had once or twice been in a man's voice. One evening in mid-October, I heard the familiar 3 and 2 at the front door. Answering it myself, I found Edward on the step and saw in a moment that his personality was the old one, which I had not encountered since the day of his ravings on the terrible ride from Chiswick. His face was twitching with mixture of odd emotions in which fear and triumph seemed to share dominion, and he looked fervently over his shoulder as I closed the door behind him. Following me clumsily to the study, he asked for some whiskey to steady his nerves. I forbore to question him, but waited till he felt like beginning whatever he wanted to say. At length he ventured some information in a choking voice. Athens has gone, Dan. We had a long talk last night while the servants were away, and I made her promise to stop praying me. Of course, I had to. I had certain occult defenses I never told you about. She had to give in, but got frightfully angry. Just packed up and started for New York. Walked right out to catch the 8:20 to Boston. I suppose people talk, but I can't help that. You mentioned that there was any trouble. Just say that she's gone on a long research trip. She's probably going to stay with one of those horrible groups of devotees, and she'll have to go west and get a divorce anyhow. I made her promise to keep away and let me alone. It was horrible to have. She was stealing my body, crowding me out, making me a prisoner, making a prisoner of me. I laid low and pretended to let her do it, but I had to be on the watch. I could plan if I was careful, for she can't read my mind literally, only in detail. All she could read of my planning all she could read of my planning was a sort of general mood of rebellion, and she always thought I was helpless. Never thought I could get the best of her, but I had a spell or two that worked. Derby looked over his shoulder and took some more whiskey. I paid off those damn servants this morning when they got back. They were ugly about it and asked questions, but they went. They're her kind, Innsmouth people, and were hand in glove with her. I hope they'll let me alone. I didn't like the way they laughed when they walked away. I must get away. I must get as many of Dad's old servants again as I can. I'll move back home now. I suppose you think I'm crazy, Dan, but Arkham history ought to hint at things that back up what I've told you. And I'm going to tell you. You've seen one of the changes too. In the car after I told you about Asnith that day coming home from Maine. That was when she got me. Drove me out of my body. Thing the last thing of the ride I remember was when I was all worked up to tell you that what that she devil is. And she got me. In a flash I was back in the house, in the library where those damn servants had me locked up. And in that cursed fiend's body that isn't even human. You know, you must have ridden home with that preying wolf in my body. You ought to have known the difference. I shuddered as Derby paused. Surely I had known the difference. I could not accept an explanation as insane. I had known, yet could I accept an explanation as insane as this? My distracted Connor was growing even wilder. I had to save myself. I had to, Dan. She'd have got me for good at the Hollows Mass. They hold a Sabbath up there beyond Chiswick, and the sacrifice would have clinched things. She'd have got me for good. She'd have been I, and I'd been her forever. Too late, my body had been hers for good. She'd been a man and fully human, just as she wanted to be. I suppose she'd have put me out of the way, killed her own ex-body with me in it, damned her just as she did before, just as he or it did before. Edward's face was now astonishingly distorted. He bent in uncomfortable closeness to mine. You must know what I hinted at in the car, that she isn't Asneth at all, but really old Ephraim himself. I suspected it a year and a half ago. I know it now. Her handwriting shows it when she's off guard. Sometimes she jots down a note in writing that's just like her father's manuscripts, stroke for stroke. And sometimes she says things that nobody but an old man like Ephraim could say. He changed forms with her when he changed forms with her when he felt his death coming. She was the only one he could find with the right kind of brain and a weak enough will. He got her body permanently, just as he almost got mine, and then poisoned the old body he put her into. Haven't you seen old Ephraim's soul glancing out of the she devil's eyes dozens of times? Out of mine when she had control of my body. The whispers, the whispering was panting and paused for breath. I said nothing, and when he resumed, his voice was nearly normal. This I reflected was a case for the asylum, but I would not be the one to send him there. Perhaps time and freedom from Asenth would do its work. I could see that he would never wish to dabble in morbid occultism again. I'll tell you more later. I must have a long rest now. I'll tell you something of the forbidden horrors she led me into, something of the age-old horrors that even now are festering in out-of-the-way corners with a monstrous priest to keep them alive. Some people know things about the universe that nobody ought to know, and can do things that nobody ought to be able to do. I've been in it up to my neck, but that's the end. Today I'll burn the damn Necronomicon and all the rest if I were librarian in the Miskatonic. But she can't get me now. I must get out of the accursed house as soon as I can and settle down at home. Help me. I know if I need help, those devilish servants you know. And if people should get too inquisitive about Asenth, you see, I can't give them her address. Then there are certain groups of searchers, certain cults, you know, that might misunderstand our breaking up. Some of them have damnable curse ideas and methods. I know you'll stand by me if anything happens, even if I have to tell you a lot of that will shock you. I had Edward stay and sleep in one of the guest chambers that night. In the morning, he seemed calmer. We discussed certain possible arrangements for his moving back into the Derby mansion, and I hoped he would lose no time in making the change. He did not call the next evening, but I saw him frequently during the ensuing weeks. We talked as little as possible about strange and unpleasant things, but discussed the renovations of the old Derby house, and the trials which Edward promised to take with my son and me the following summer. Of Asnes we said almost nothing, for I saw that the subject was a peculiarly disturbing one. Gossip, of course, was rife. That was no novelty in context with the strange menae of the old Crownshield house. But one thing I did not like was what Derby's banker let fall at a expensive mood in the Miskatonic Club about the checks Edward was sending regularly to a Moses and Abigail Sargent and a Eugene Babson in Innsmouth. That looked as if these evil-faced servants were extorting some kind of tribute from him. He had not mentioned that matter to me. I wished that the summer and my son's Harvard vacation would come, so that we could get Edward to Europe. He was not, I soon saw, mending as rapidly as I had hoped he would. For there was something a bit hysterical in his occasional exhilarations while his mood of fright and depression were altogether too frequent. The old Derby house was ready by December, yet Edward constantly put off moving. Though he hated and seemed to fear the Crownshield place, he was at the same time queerly enslaved by it. He could not seem to begin dismantling things, and invented every kind of excuse to postpone action. When I pointed this out to him, he appeared unaccustomedly frightened. His father's old butler, who was there with other reacquainted family servants, told me one day that Edward's occasional prowlings about the house, and especially down the cellar, looked oddly and unwholesomely to him. I wondered if Asenth had been writing disturbing letters, but the butler said there was no mail which could have come from her. It was about Christmas that Derby broke down one evening while calling on me. I was steering the conversation towards next summer's travels when he suddenly shrieked and leaped up from his chair with a look of shocking, uncontrollable fright, a cosmic panic and loathing such as only the nether gulfs of nightmares could bring on any sane mind. My brain, my brain, goddamn, it's tugging, beyond, knocking, clawing, that she-devil even now. Ephraim, Kamog, the pit of the Shoggoth, Il Shabbat Nagarath, the goat with 1,000 young, the flame beyond body, beyond life, in the earth, oh God! I was pulled back. I pulled him back in his chair and poured some wine down his throat as his frenzy sank to a dull apathy. He did not resist, but kept his lips moving as if talking to himself. Presently I realized that he was trying to talk to me, and bent my ear to his mouth to catch the feeble words. Again, he's trying. might have known nothing could stop that force. Not distance, not magic, not death. It comes and comes mostly in the night. I can't leave. It's horrible. God damn, if you only knew as I do just how horrible it is. When he had slumped down into a stupor, I propped him with pillows and let normal sleep overtake him. I did not call a doctor before I knew what would be said of his sanity, and wished to not to give nature a chance if I could possibly. He waked at midnight, and I put him in bed upstairs, but he was gone by morning. He let himself out quietly. He had let himself quietly out of the house, and his butler, when called on the wire, said he was home pacing restlessly about the library. Edward went to pieces rapidly after that. He did not call again, but I went daily to see him. He would always be sitting in the library, staring at nothing and having an air of abnormal listening. Sometimes he talked rationally, but always of trivial topics. Any mention of his trouble, of future plans, or of absinthe would send him into a frenzy. His butler said he had frightful seizures at night, during which he might eventually do self harm. And a long talk with his doctor, banker, and lawyer, and finally took the physician with two specialist colleagues to visit. The spasms that resulted from the first question were violent and palpable, and that evening a close car took his poor, struggling body to Arkham Santorum. I was made his guardian, called on him twice weekly, almost weeping to hear his wild shrieks, awesome whispers, and dreadful droning repetitions of such phrases as "I had to do it, I had to do it. It'll get me down there in the dark. Mother, mother, man, save me, save me." How much hope of recovery there was, no one could say, but I tried my best to be optimistic. Edward must have a home if he emerged, so I transferred his servants to the Derby mansion, which would surely be his sane choice. What to do about the Crownshield place was, with its complex arrangements and collections of utterly inexplicable objects, I could not decide, so left it momentarily untouched, telling the Derby housemaid to go over and dust the chief rooms once a week, and ordering the furnace man to have a fire on those days. The foul nightmare came before Candlesmiths, heralded in cruel irony by a false gleam of hope. One morning late in January, the Santorum telephoned to report that Edward's reason had suddenly come back. His continuous memory, they said, was badly impaired, but sanity itself was certain. Of course, he must remain some time for observation, but there could be little doubt of the outcome. All going well, he would surely be free in a week. I hastened over in a flood of delight, but stood bewildered when a nurse took me to Edward's room. The patient rose to greet me, extending his hand with a polite smile, but I saw in an instant that he bore the strange, energized personality which had seemed so foreign to his own nature. The competent personality I had found so vaguely horrible, and which Edward himself had once vowed was the intruding soul of his wife. There was the same blazing vision, so like Asnath and old Ephraim's, and the same firm mouth, and when he spoke I could sense the same grim, verse irony in his voice, the deep irony so redolent and of potential evil. This was the person who had driven my car through the night 5 months before, person I had not seen since that brief call when he had forgotten the old doorbell signal and stirred such nebulous fears in me, and now he filled me with the same dim feeling of blasphemous alienage and infallible cosmic hideousness. He spoke affably of arrangements for release, and there was nothing for me to do but assent despite some remarkable gaps in his recent memory, and I felt that something was terribly, inexplicably wrong and abnormal. There were horrors in this thing that I could not reach. There was a sane person, but was it indeed the Edward Derby I had known? If not, Who or what was it? And where was Edward? Ought it be free or confined? Or ought it be exasperated from the face of the earth? There was a hint of the abysmal sardonic in everything the creature said, like the asset-like eyes lent a special and baffling mockery to certain words about the early liberty earned by a especially close confinement. I must behave very awkwardly, and was glad to beat a retreat. All that day and the next, I racked my brain over the problem. What had happened? What sort of mind looked out through those alien eyes in Edward's face? I could think of nothing but this dimly terrible enigma, and gave up all efforts to perform my usual work. The second morning, the hospital called up to say that the recovered patient was unchanged, and by evening I was close to a nervous collapse. A state, I admit, though others will vow it colored my subsequent vision. I have nothing to say on this point except that no madness of mine could account for all the evidence. It was in the night after the second evening that struck. Utter horror burst out over me and weighed my spirit with a black, clutching panic from which I could never shake free. It began with a telephone call just before midnight. I was the only one up and sleepily took down the receiver in the library. No one seemed to be on the wire, and I was about to hang up and go to bed when my ear caught a very faint suspicion of sound at the other end. Was someone trying under great difficulty to talk? As I listened, I thought I heard a sort of half-liquid bubbling noise, which had an odd suggestion of inarticulate, unintelligible word and simple division. I called, "Who is it?" But they only answered, "Oh." I could only assume that the noise was mechanical, but fancying that it might be a case of a broken instrument able to receive, but not to send. I added, "I can't hear you. Better hang up and try information." Immediately I heard the receiver go on the hook on the other end. This to say, it was just before midnight. When the call was traced afterwards, it was found to come from the old Crownfield house. That was fully half a week from the housemaid's day to be there. I shall only hint at what was found at the house. The upheaval in remote cellar, storeroom, the tracks, the dirt, the hastily rifled wardrobe, the baffling marks on the telephone, the clumsy, used stationery, and the detestable stench lingering over everything. The police, poor fools, have their smug little theories and are still searching for those sinister discharged servants who have dropped out of sight amidst the present fervor. They speak of ghoulish revenge for things that were done, and say I was included because I was Edward's best friend and advisor. Idiots. Do they fancy those brutish clowns could have forged that handwriting? Do they fancy they could have brought what later came? Are they blind to the changes in the body that was Edward's? As for me, I now believe all that Edward Derby ever told me. There are horrors beyond life's edge that we do not suspect, and once in a while man's evil prying calls them just within our range. Ephraim Russeth, that devil called them in, and they engulfed Edward as they are engulfing me. Can I be sure that I am safe? Those powers survived life in the physical form. The next day, in the afternoon, when I pulled out of my prostrations and was able to walk and talk coherently, I went to the madhouse and shot him dead for Edward's and for the world's sake. Can I be sure it is all cremated? But can I be sure till it is cremated? They're keeping the body for some silly autopsies by different doctors. But I say he must be cremated. He must be cremated. He who is not Edward Derby when I shot him. I shall go mad if he's not, for I may be next. But my will is not weak, and I shall not let it be undermined by the terrors I know are searching round it. One life, Ephraim, Aseneth, and Edward. Who now? I will not be driven out of my body. I will not change souls with that bullet-ridden lich in the madhouse. But let me try and tell coherently of the final horror. I will not speak of what the police persistently ignore, the tales of the dwarf grotesque, latest thing met by at least 3 wayfarers in High Street, just before 2 o'clock, and the nature of the single footprints in certain places. I will say only that just about 2 the doorbell and knocker waked me. The doorbell and knocker both plied alternately and uncertainly in a kind of weak desperation, and each trying to keep to Edward's old signal of 3 and 2 strokes. Roused from the sound, my mind leaped into a turmoil. Derby at the door, and remembering the old code. The new personality had not remembered it. It was Edward suddenly back in his rightful state. Why was he here in such evident stress and haste? Had he been released ahead of time, or had he escaped? Perhaps I thought, as I flung on a robe and bounded downstairs, his return to his old self had brought raving and violence, revoking his discharge, and driving him to a desperate dash for freedom. Whatever happened, he was good old Edward again, and I would help him. When I opened the door into the elm arched blackness and gust. When I opened the door into the elm arched blackness, a gust of insufferable fetid wind almost flung me prostrate. I choked in nausea and for a second scarcely saw the dwarf humped figure on the step. The summon had been Edward's, but who was this foul, stunted parody? Where had Edward gone? The ring had sounded only a second before the door opened. The collar had one of Edward's overcoats, its bottom almost touching the ground, and its sleeve rolled back, yet still covering the hands. On the head was a slouched hat pulled low, while a black silk muffler concealed the face. As I stepped unsteadily forward, the figure made a semi-liquid sound like that I had heard over the phone, and thrust at me a large, closely written paper impaled on the end of a long pencil. Still reeling from the morbid and unaccountable fervor, I seized this paper and tried to read it in the light from the doorway. Beyond question, it was Edward's script, but why had he written when he was close enough to ring? Why was the script so awkward, coarse, and shaky? I could make out nothing in the dim half-light, so edged back into the hallway, the dwarf figure clumping mechanically after, but pausing on the inner door's threshold. The odor of this singular messenger was really appalling. I hoped, not in vain, thank God, that my wife would not wake and confront it. And as I read the paper, I felt my knees give under me and my vision go black. I was lying on the floor when I came to, the cursed sheet still clutched in my fear-rigid hand. This is what it said. Damn. Go to the sanatorium and kill it. Exterminate it. It isn't Edward Derby anymore. He got me. It's Athens, and she has been dead 3 months and a half. I lied when I said she had gone. I killed her. I had to. It was sudden, but we were alone and I was in my right body. I saw a candlestick and smashed her head in. She would have got me if good at Hallmass. Buried her in the farther cellar storeroom under some old boxes and cleaned up all the traces. The servants suspected next morning, but they had such secrets that they dare not tell the police. I sent them off, but God knows what they'd do. And others of the cult. I thought for a while I was all right, and then I felt the tugging at my brain. I knew what it was. I ought to have remembered. A soul like hers, or Ephraim's, a half-detached half, and kept right on after death so long as the body lasts. She was getting me, making me change bodies with her, seizing my body and putting me in the corpse of hers buried in the cellar. I knew what was coming. That's why I snapped and had to go to the asylum. Then it came. I found myself choked in the dark in Asnath's rotting carcass down there in the cellar, under the boxes where I put it. And I knew she must be in my body. At the sanatorium, permanently for it was after Halamas, and the sacrifice would work even without her being there. Sane and ready for release as a menace to the world, I was desperate, and in spite of everything, I clawed my way out. I'm too far gone to talk. I couldn't manage to telephone, but I can still write. I'll get fixed up somehow and bring this to these last words and warning. Kill that fiend if you value the peace and comfort of the world. See that it's cremated. If you don't, it will live on and on, body to body forever. And I can't tell you what it will do. Keep clear of black magic, Dan. It's the devil's business. Goodbye. You've been a great friend. Tell the police whatever they'll believe, and I'm damnably sorry to drag all this on you. I'll be at peace before long. This thing won't hold together much more. Hope you can read this and kill that thing. Kill it. Yours, Edward. It was only afterwards that I read the last half of the paper, for I had fainted at the end of the third paragraph. I fainted again when I saw and smelled what cluttered up the threshold where the warm air had struck it. The messenger would not move or have consciousness any more. The butler, more tough-fibered than I, did not faint at what met him in the hall in that morning. Instead, he telephoned the police. When they came, I had been taken upstairs to bed, but the other mass laid where it had collapsed in that night. The men put handkerchiefs to their mouths. What they finally found inside Edward's oddly assorted clothes was mostly liquescent horror. There were bones, too, and a crushed-in skull. Some dental work possibly identified. Some dental work possibly identified the skull as Hasn's. I hope you guys enjoy that. It was a bit of a struggle for me, but let's just say it won't be the last time this happens. Goodbye, and pleasant dreams.